Having a bit of a hard time with his video, but we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Vidya. I serve as COO here at MedCrypt. MedCrypt is the entity that owns the MedISAO. Axel Worth serves as our Chief Strategy Officer, and he is also at MedCrypt and been in the space for a long time. So he literally wrote the book on device cybersecurity. So happy that he's able to join us today and talk through regulatory requirements particular to cybersecurity for device manufacturers. So there's a lot of things that can dictate a security strategy, right? One would think it could be limited to technology or what is cutting edge or required for clinical operation. In fact, we're seeing a lot more of an evolution when it comes to regulatory expectations. So that means having more reporting requirements, whether to the regulator or to customers, and to really understand how that plays out with security is something that perhaps hasn't historically been perceived as a security strategy driver. There's also a lot more around QMS expectations, clinical data in particular, and just the evolving complexity of technology, right? As we see new clinical technologies emerge, it can sometimes be more readily delivered if we leverage kind of new cutting edge technology. A great example of this is AI, ML. How do you define security around those sorts of things? In the universe of devices, a lot of times device makers will not sell into only one market. They'll have multiple markets that they need to meet. And because the world is the way it is, not all requirements are harmonized. So you kind of have three major players who are setting kind of the strategy for a lot of locations here. You have the US FDA, you have the EU, which follows MDR, and then in Canada, you have something called Health Canada. And the three of those have regulations around security. And there's a few other ones globally, like Australia and Japan, that also, but those tend to mirror what we see across these three. So when you think about how do I build a strategy, do you say, okay, I'm going to have a different strategy for each of these locations? Do I have a different security posture for each of these locations? Or do I try to harmonize and go with the most restrictive or the least restrictive? You think about kind of how you can get the best bang for security effort, for lack of a better term. So the plan for the webinar is to kind of talk through these three in particular and outline some of the co-overlaps that we see, as well as identify some of the unique things. So I alluded to this, right? The US FDA has what they call the pre and post-market guidance in particular. Those tend to drive a lot of the security expectations for the most part. And we see that those guidances, while not having been updated in too recent, we expect an update to post-market guidance sometime in the next couple years here. And the pre-market guidance, we believe, is currently being worked on as part of an annual feedback loop. The EU has MDR and IVDR. When we look at their cybersecurity requirements, we also see references to MDCG. And so those collectively kind of cover what would be needed for the EU. There's also a couple of ISO standards in particular that folks tend to point to regularly that could be of relevance and you should likely become familiar with. In particular, ISO 14971 is a big one, and IEC 62304. These are ones we see regularly referenced across multiple regulators, so that could be one of those getting more for effort when we think about security prioritization. So let's talk about the US FDA first. So as we know, there's the FD&C Act, and there's a section called 524B. In 524B, there's explicit reference to kind of three main areas that are kind of SBOM vulnerability specific, right? So there's a first expectation is that you have a comprehensive SBOM. If you've been attending any of these prior webinars, what is the definition of comprehensive? It's somewhat nebulous by design. The FDA really just wants to see a worthwhile effort and a best effort put in to get a cybersecurity software bill of materials together. And so that can really include all facets of your device, right? If you have a bedside programmer talking to an implantable, talking to a cloud device, you want to make sure you kind of have reflecting all of those areas of what a device is including. The next main section talks about having a requirement for vulnerabilities, making sure those are identified, and you have a way to determine whether your device is impacted by a vulnerability. So not only, hey, I know there are vulnerabilities that impact my software bill of materials, but yes, I also understand what the impact of these vulnerabilities on my device are. The last one is talking about updates and patches. 524B makes reference to having a process in place for timely updates. What is timely? Not super well defined, but there is an expectation that there be some communication on a regular cadence within that 90-day period of identification. And so I think the expectation here is that you really have a comprehensive, robust vulnerability management program, which inherently means you would need a software bill of materials. You need something to track vulnerabilities, and you need a way to manage those remediations as well. The FDA also has what's called the Premarket Cybersecurity Guidance. You'll see a lot of overlap here. So the need for a comprehensive SBOM also reflected in Premarket guidance. Having a way to assess, that's that same, hey, I found a vulnerability. How do I know if it applies to me? Having a process for updating and replacing third-party components. The Premarket guidance speaks more about third-party components. So end of support, end of life for third-party components is a big area where the Premarket guidance speaks to. And having documentation around test results. So making sure that there is testing around pen testing, scanning, and code reviews as part of your development lifecycle is further referenced in Premarket. If we think about vulnerability management in particular, that goes to that vulnerability scanning aspect before. So how do I make sure that I am aware of the latest log4j or whatever else is coming out, and I know that it impacts the libraries or components in my device? Post-market guidance, kind of similar to what we saw in 524B, this continuous monitoring idea is that you have an ongoing process. So when we think about guidance, there's some things that can be solved technically. There's some things that can be solved from a process perspective. Continuous monitoring is absolutely one of those process things. So making sure there's a way to identify ongoing threats or ongoing new vulnerabilities, something like the KEV list, making sure you know if something is being actively exploited. Having a process in place for that is the expectation from post-market guidance. That then trickles over into, okay, I have to be able to assess my vulnerabilities and know if I'm impacted. I have to be able to remediate if something comes up. I have to be able to communicate with my customers through coordinated disclosure. And then the last one is having an incident response plan, which is, hey, something has occurred. We have an incident that is underway, and having a plan for responding to that. So transitioning into the EU. So for those who have been working with MDR, EU MDR, to be clear, does not have an explicit expectation around software bill of materials, but they do have cybersecurity expectations. So the principles that we consider here has to do with having the security facets being part of the QMS. So making sure that where the QMS needs to reference security or consider security, that happens. This is also further seen in a continuous risk assessment. So not just up to the point of being developed and getting out the door, but once the device is live in the field, once it's end of support, end of life, having a process for how that's continually managed is part of MDR's expectations. State of the art, this is one of those hard ones, right? What is state of the art? But that's certainly one of the things that MDR says, hey, we want you to leverage what is best of breed right now and staying on top of that. Now, it doesn't mean you necessarily have to do what is state of the art, but trying to consider those principles as you architect the next version is, I think, the expectation here. And then there's other standards that are referenced in EU. Oops, we lost a couple. Such as the one referenced under harmonized standards, and that could make life a little bit easier if you're in multiple markets to have a single standard that can be applied to both locations or both regulators. So there's some pre-market requirements, in particular, secure software development lifecycle, a lot having to do with how the product is actually developed. So whether it comes to secure architecture, having requirements that are clearly aligned and communicated when it comes to secure development practices, and how folks maintain that security posture over the lifetime of the device. You'll see a special note under SBOM. While it's not an explicit requirement under MDR, there are references to what is called SOUP configuration items, so software of unknown provenance. And the idea behind that is, hey, if I'm using a bunch of third-party components, I now need to keep track of those third-party components and be able to understand if they're deprecated or something has happened. Now, it might not be referenced explicitly as a software bill of materials, but that functionally, to do that and meet that SOUP management, you would really benefit from having an SBOM and then leveraging the process around managing the SBOM to meet that expectation. EU, similar to the US, also has vulnerability testing expectations and documentation, absolutely. The human factors in security design is a little bit more explicitly discussed in the EU MDR, but we certainly see a harmonization in terms of how security features and requirements would fit into how it's developed in the US also. Some of the post-market guidance items from the EU have to do with continuous monitoring, similar to what we saw in the US, same with vulnerability assessment, timely patching, coordinated vulnerability. One of the, vigilance reporting is kind of similar to what we have in the US with coordinated vulnerability, as well as it's slightly different documentation, but the essence of what you're trying to do there is similar. And again, while the MDR does not explicitly say you need to have coordinated vulnerability disclosure, by trying to meet the expectations of the MDCG guidances, you would functionally have a process that would say, I need to be able to coordinate. And so by having that process in place, while they may not call it the coordinated vulnerability disclosure, you would still need something similar. So you have an overlap there with the US guidance. And then the last one here around vigilance reporting, similar to kind of what we saw in the US, having incidents or any issues, whether it's like the catalyst, making sure that that is discussed is also part of the EU's expectations. Health Canada is the third one we were going to look at. So with Health Canada, it's the same kind of spirit of having security be integrated into the quality management system and secure development lifecycle. We see similar expectations around testing and making sure vulnerability assessments are part of what is being completed for a device, along with pen testing. Having a comprehensive strategy is something that we see required as part of Health Canada's explicit expectations. I think to meet the other countries' regulatory expectations, you would inherently have to have a strategy, but they call it out a bit more explicitly. There they call it the Cybersecurity Bill of Materials. For those who have been in this area a bit longer, you may remember that that was the original version in the FDA's guidances, but they subsequently changed it to Software Bill of Materials. Health Canada still has it as cybersecurity, so the expectation there is, again, best effort, but likely including more around your hardware. One, I guess, asterisk I would put around all these software bill of material conversations, there's increasing conversation about having your cryptography algorithms be included in an SBOM. Maybe that's the right place for it, maybe it's not, but it's kind of the current events when it comes to thinking about additional things that should be living in a BOM. And then the only other things that are referenced here are kind of overlapped again from the other regulators when it comes to continuous monitoring, having a process in place for responding and being proactive in pushing those fixes out to devices. So comparing all of these, we see kind of thematically the same 5 things showing up every time, right, across all the locations. When it comes to what would meet all 3 regulator expectations, absolutely around risk management, design principles, the SBOM, post-market surveillance, coordinated vulnerability, incident response, and documentation are all strongly overlapped here. Now, what each document is called might be slightly different, or how it presents, but if you follow at least these core principles and ensure they are addressed, then you would get coverage across all 3 regulators. With the FDA, again, they explicitly have a mandate for the SBOM and making sure it's included. Again, a cyber device doesn't have to be something that is connecting to the internet. It's anything really running software or having a USB port or radio frequency. Really, a lot of those are encompassed as well when it comes to what is a cybersecurity device. Having CVSS scores, this is explicitly asked for with the FDA. Having recommendations for remediation, again, they are recommendations, but they do exist. And community reporting and participation, whether it's in an ISAO or an ISAC, that's part of the FDA's expectations. And then reporting is part of 21 CFR Part 806, which again is unique to the US. In the EU, what we see as unique is we see more of this holistic concept, right, of making sure that that patient safety aspect is a bit more explicitly called out. State of the art, as mentioned before, making sure it's harmonized across relevant standards. And while, as I've said before, there's no explicit SBOM mandate, the SOUP management functionally would need to be supported by some sort of list of all components, which if you were already hitting another regulator, an SBOM could meet that expectation as well. We see embedded security requirements in other areas, whether it's performance requirements or safety, and making sure that security is discussed in those areas as well. And then the last one is having a vigilance system, so something that speaks to those safety aspects, whether there's a serious security incident or if there are trends around security that need to be reported by a device manufacturer. Health Canada, they have a little bit of modification with their SBOM expectations. For class 3 and 4 devices, there's an expectation for an SBOM. So if you're a different class, then you don't necessarily need to have an SBOM. Focusing on risk management and having a way to evaluate to get to an acceptable level is what they call it in Health Canada. Having a device-specific quality plans, that's only for class 4, and then the life cycle plan, which I think is similar to life cycle management and documentation, kind of having those processes referenced when it comes to vulnerability management, is the idea there, but they call it the life cycle plan. Additional resources available, and again, this deck will be sent out, but we have a few more webinars that go more explicitly into overlaps of the EU and the US, as well as how to prepare for Health Canada and the EU. And so there's another webinar coming up in a few weeks to learn more about EU and FDA, where we are partnering with the Owner Institute. If you're interested or have a submission coming up where you're going to be in the EU as well, you might want to attend that. And that is the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out or post them in the Q&A. We'll give it a couple minutes for folks to share if they have any questions or thoughts. But as mentioned, I will make sure the deck is sent out, as well as the recording of the webinar as well. Kelly, with regards to reporting vulnerabilities to an ISAO, is the regulatory expectation to report vulnerabilities that could potentially result in patient harm, or are low-risk vulnerabilities also expected? So not low risk. The expectation is as you do your assessment of the vulnerabilities, depending on whether it's high or critical, is typically the threshold for when you need to report through the ISAO. I've seen some manufacturers where there's an explicit patient safety, they will both report it through the ISAO as well as through whatever their own website and patient safety portal or product safety portal exist. But for FDA expectations, high and critical is really what they're looking for. Yep, no problem. I'm guessing Axel's laptop went kaput on him, and that's why he didn't join us. But I will see if he has any flavor to add, and maybe he'll do a 2-minute video that we'll send out with the webinar as well. But apologies that he wasn't able to be here. I'll try to get him on one of the future ones. Okay, great. If any other questions come up, don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Axel, or the info@medisao email, and we are happy to connect. All the best, and thank you everyone for your time and attendance. Take care.